All right, good day. The YMCA Education Series is free and open to the public, so we encourage you to spread the word and invite family and friends to participate. We host approximately 6 to 8 of these a month, varying in all types of different topics. This program will last about an hour. If you find you have questions during it, feel free to put it in the chat box. If it's a pressing issue or a question, feel free to raise your hand and the speaker will try to get to it at that point. Otherwise, we'll try to answer the questions towards the end of the presentation. Thank you again for joining us today as we hear about current trends in vaping from the Glenview Northbrook Coalition for Youth. Today we have Erin Tegge, who is talking to us as the coordinator, the prevention program coordinator at Peer Services, which is under the whole GNCY umbrella. I don't know, she'll definitely tell us more about that as she talks. I'd like to welcome Erin with current trends in vaping, talking to your teen about tough topics. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you. So I am going to get my presentation up as we go through the topic today. So yes, current trends in vaping. It is still, I think, consistently one of the most requested topics that I get. So it's always good to stay up to date on the ever-changing world of vaping. So first, initially, just a little bit more about myself, about Peer Services, about GNCY. So I do work for Peer Services. We are a local substance use prevention and treatment agency. We have 2 locations, one in downtown Evanston, and then a more recent location. We are partnering with Turning Point, which is located in Skokie as kind of our satellite office. And then I am, as Peer Services, as a prevention coordinator, play a very large role in the Glenview Northbrook Coalition for Youth, which is a local substance use prevention community coalition, which really brings together community stakeholders throughout Glenview and Northbrook to really support our youth to live safe drug and alcohol-free lives. So our plan for today is to go through vaping. And when we're talking about vaping, we may be talking about e-cigarettes and cannabis. So I'm going to go through and talk about vaping under both of those categories. Then I'm going to share a little bit about current data that we have about adolescent use regarding vaping. And then hopefully we have time talk about some tips on talking with teens about this particular topic. It is one that, yes, I talk about lots. So to get us started, we're going to first talk about e-cigarettes. And with e-cigarettes, we are first going to go over kind of the different types that we're seeing, the different trends that of different products, flavors, etc., that we're seeing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the use and effects of teens using e-cigarettes. So e-cigarettes, just basic overview of what they are. They are an electronic device that heats a liquid, an e-liquid, and then it is then inhaled by the user. It is an aerosol that is created that then is inhaled into the lungs, and then the effects of that nicotine are then experienced by the user. As I had previously said, these devices, with e-cigarettes, they are being used for nicotine, but they also can be used for cannabis, THC, that we will get to in a little bit. There's a variety of names that e-cigarettes go by. So depending on who you're talking to, they may absolutely use a different terminology. Some of the more common ones, e-cigs, vape pens, dab pens, tanks, mods, pod mods, ENDS, which stands for electronic nicotine delivery system. That is actually the technical name of e-cigarettes, the electronic nicotine delivery system. So, you know, it's always good to know as we're thinking about our youth, as we're thinking about our own awareness, you know, the topics that are important to our youth or that may be impacting them, to know what that kind of current terminology is. Just 2 days ago, I think it was, earlier this week, I was in a high school talking to a bunch of students about e-cigarettes. We were just very specifically focused on e-cigarettes. And I was talking to one of the students, you know, about the activity that we were doing. And I was like, oh, it's about e-cigarettes. And he looked at me and he was like, what are you talking about? I was like, vapes. He's like, oh, okay. So really, it depends on who you're talking to. That language is a really, really important component. So on the right, there is just a diagram of what kind of makes up an e-cigarette or vaping device. So they all have some sort of battery. Some of them are rechargeable, some of them not are rechargeable. We'll get into that in the next slide. They'll have some sort of sensor. They have what's called an atomizer, and that's the coil, that's the heating element, which then heats the liquid. And then at that top part, that is where the cartridge is that holds whatever e-liquid the user is using. And then it goes out that top part in the mouthpiece and is inhaled. So over the now, I don't know, almost 10 years that e-cigarettes have really been around on the market, probably more like 8. There are a lot of different types, and there kind of has been an evolution in the e-cigarettes that are on the market. So the box all the way on the left side of the screen, that is kind of the first generation of e-cigarettes that were on the market. When they first came out onto the market, they really were targeted and designed for current adult smokers. You know, if you've heard over the years in the news, as anyone talks about e-cigarettes, it was initially marketed as, you know, quit smoking, switch to e-cigs, they're much less harmful, or as potential cigarette cessation device. And so the design of them really was made to look like an actual cigarette. So you can see in these top couple examples, those do look like traditional cigarettes, because at that time, they were really targeted towards current cigarette users. That has very much changed over the years. So then things kind of kept evolving, and, you know, we get vape pens, and I would say all the rest kind of came out at various similar times. So we have vape pens that are pre-filled, potentially refillable. They had a much longer battery than the initial ones. You know, I guess the technology evolved. And over time, they definitely started to create lots of different flavors, lots of different options for the users. Then we also have vape mods or tanks, and these are like the really big, clunky ones. Definitely not what most teens are using, because they are pretty large. They are absolutely meant to be refillable. They vary in temperature and all of the things, apparently, to make the user experience better. But lots of different shapes and sizes, more really towards kind of that adult audience, mainly because they're so big and clunky and not really discreet. Then what really, I would say, exploded the e-cigarette market, especially towards youth, were the pod mods. And so the most famous brand that you've probably heard of is Juul, Juul. When they first came out on the market, like 2015-ish, they, I mean, completely changed the face of e-cigarettes. Juul is most known for their fight with the FDA and the fight with, I guess, the general public on their marketing tactics, that they were really marketing their product towards youth. And it really was because these devices, I mean, as you can see, so these up here is a Juul. It was small. It looked like a USB drive. It was easily hideable. Adults, for the most part, had no clue what they were. So a lot of adults didn't know when a youth was using them because it looked like a USB drive. And it would recharge in the USB port of someone's computer. And so that really changed and impacted e-cigarettes for youth. The other component with Juul was the flavor aspect. Lots of different flavors. Mango apparently was their most popular and what was most attractive for youth, but they used to have a lot of different flavors like mango, like creme brulee, fruit punch, lots of fruity, yummy, delicious sounding things that would go into their e-cigarettes. And so when the user was using it, they were just tasting that flavor and not necessarily experiencing that, nicotine tobacco flavor that, traditional cigarettes or other traditional tobacco products have. And so at the time, back, 2016, 2017, 2018, et cetera, this was absolutely the product of choice among youth. Because again, it was easily hideable, fruit flavored, relatively cheap, and just they made their marketing very attractive towards youth. There were some other brands at the time that were also popular, not as popular as Juul. So these two are from the Soren brand. But like this red one, it looks like it could be a highlighter or, bottle of, I don't know what, definitely not a vaping device. So one of the interesting things that has since happened most recently, because since Juul, there were many lawsuits, many things with the FDA. What ended up happening with Juul is they were no longer able to sell flavored products. So any device that has a pod, so a not refillable, where you take the pod out, put a new pod in, so the actual device stays the same, but you switch out the e-liquid. Those specific types of devices, the FDA banned flavored tobacco as one of the ways to decrease youth use. However, which is great. However, when that happened, one of the things that changed was students kind of switched back towards vape pens that are disposable, not refillable. So it's kind of a one and done. And the policy and the laws about flavored tobacco don't currently exist for those types of e-cigarettes. The reason that this is so important is because 85% of our youth who use e-cigarettes use flavored products. So while it's great that the FDA banned the refillable cartridge flavorings, now all of the disposable e-cigarettes are what our youth are using, because there are still all of the flavors available. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of flavors out there. And so what we're seeing, what we're hearing is, well, definitely the most popular one, fairly consistently over the last, I would say almost a year, is this middle one, which is called Posh. That's consistently what we hear about the most commonly used substance. We have, there's a few other examples on here. There's Stig, this is Puff Bar, Blue also has one, but I hear over and over again from schools, from parents, that Posh seems to be definitely the brand of choice kind of in our community. So, yes, while there was a lot of progress made about banning flavors for certain types of e-cigarettes, it does not include all of them. And that is what we are seeing our teens use. So that flavor component is really, really integral and really important in understanding kind of why our youth are using. And it's because of the flavors. They want to taste something yummy. So when, someone is using an e-cigarette, when they're vaping an e-cigarette, there's still a fair amount of unknowns, but we are absolutely learning more and more and more about kind of the harms and the risks associated with using e-cigarettes. The policies and regulations on e-cigarettes is still not great. Yes, for a couple years now, e-cigarettes have had to have the nicotine warning label, because initially when e-cigarettes came out on the market, a lot of people didn't think there was nicotine in them. There absolutely is. So they all definitely have that. And e-cigarette companies are supposed to be reporting to the FDA all of the ingredients that are in their products. However, execution on that one, not so great. So there are a lot of ingredients that are absolutely not reported. And a lot of these ingredients and these chemicals that we're seeing in e-cigarettes are very similar, if not the same, as what we see in traditional tobacco products. So, things that are showing up and have consistently shown up in e-cigarettes, things like lead, nickel, tin, different types of metals, acetone, formaldehyde, The list goes on and on. And so with these pictures that are over here, these are examples of how some of these chemicals on the left, how they are used elsewhere in the world. So obviously acetone is nail polish remover. Rubidium is what makes purple fireworks purple. Formaldehyde, obviously embalming things, different pesticides, etc. And so while initially e-cigarette companies, and to some extent still do, they try and market their product as a better, safer alternative than traditional tobacco products, it absolutely is not. The unfortunate thing is e-cigarettes haven't been around long enough for us to really know and understand the long-term effects that exist. You know, we have decades and decades and decades of research about traditional tobacco products that it absolutely causes lung cancer. It can cause other types of cancers and other cardiovascular issues, etc. But still not enough time has passed for us to really know and understand some of those long-term effects. We do know that there is nicotine. We do know that nicotine is, you know, one of the components of a lot of those health issues. And so we can educationally assume that some of the similar effects that we've seen from long-term cigarette use will also exist with e-cigarettes, but we just don't know yet. And one of the other really important components that I mentioned initially is that what is coming out of an e-cigarette is an aerosol. And I think it's really confusing with the terminology because it's vaping. So you automatically think of vapor, which is just water, but in fact, it is an aerosol. And that means there are chemicals, metal particulates, all sorts of different things in what is being inhaled and exhaled that is then getting into your lungs, then exhaling out into the world around you. And so getting all of these chemicals either in your lungs or, again, around the user out into the environment. So again, one of the other big differences between kind of traditional cigarettes versus electronic cigarettes is the kind of type of nicotine that is used. So in traditional cigarettes, it's used, or it's called a free base nicotine. However, with electronic cigarettes, and this very much came from Juul as well, they developed nicotine salts. So whatever chemical, whatever thing that they did to the liquid nicotine, it's what they call nicotine salts. And what that does, your body absorbs it much faster and much higher levels. So your body is absolutely absorbing and taking in more nicotine when using an e-cigarette than versus traditional cigarettes. And so one of the most common kind of sayings that we've had in this field, specifically with Juul, and we have, you know, the other examples on the screen too, is one pod, so one of those little cartridges that goes into Juul is equivalent to one pack of cigarettes. And, you know, that is something that whenever I tell youth that, and they haven't heard that before, oh my goodness, they're like, what? Because, you know, they would never smoke an entire pack of cigarettes. But when you tell them that one Juul pod, one of those devices, is the same thing as going through an entire pack of cigarettes, they're like, oh my goodness, really, really impactful. And just thinking about how easy it is to go through an e-cigarette. You know, if you think about traditional tobacco products that you have to light, so there's that combustion aspect. When you light a cigarette, after about 10 puffs is what it is average, the cigarette's done. And so typically whoever is smoking, after one cigarette, it's over, it's done, put it down, move on with their day until however many hours later. However, with e-cigarettes, there is no natural stopping point until the entire cartridge or the entire pod is gone. And so for Juul, that's about 200 puffs. And that's how we figure out the comparison of one pod, one pack. So they can just puff, 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 and all of a sudden going through a pod in a day or 2 days or however long, because there isn't those natural stopping points. So one of the things that we're seeing now with a lot of the newer brands, the newer disposables, is kind of the amount per e-cigarette has grown significantly. So Stig is much smaller, much more similar compared to a Juul, similar amount of puffs, nicotine content similar to that of a pack of cigarettes. However, Posh, again, the kind of most common brand we're hearing about among our youth, there can be, depending on the device, between 1,500 and 3,000 puffs. So that's between 7 and 15 packs of cigarettes in one device. I will say the Posh devices that are around 3,000 or so puffs are definitely larger. And so I think still what we're seeing is the smaller Posh devices that are around 1,500 puffs, but still 1,500 puffs, 7 packs of cigarettes. That is a lot of nicotine that is going into that person's body. So, you know, I think as adults, as caring adults who interact with youth, kind of helping them understand and knowing what actually could potentially be going into their body is a really, really important component. And it's interesting because the way that Posh kind of labels their products, they very much clearly say how many puffs is in. I mean, they're promoting it as a good thing that you can get so many puffs out of one device. I see it as a little bit scary. But a lot of nicotine is getting absorbed into the body at very high levels with e-cigarettes. So some of the effects that we're seeing from e-cigarettes, and this is because they do contain nicotine. Nicotine is highly addictive. We know that 90% of adult smokers began using before the age of 18. And so especially if our youth are being exposed to nicotine prior to their brain fully being developed, it's a really important aspect, they are at significantly higher risks of becoming addicted to that nicotine. Nicotine often is compared to heroin or cocaine in terms of the addictive quality of it. If anyone has ever known anyone who has tried to quit smoking or tried to quit e-cigarettes, is really, really hard because it is so addicted. And thinking about other ways that nicotine impacts our youth, specifically, it impacts how their brain controls attention and learning, which obviously is really important for middle school and high school students. They are learning so much information so fast, so many different areas, and nicotine disrupts that. It alters the way that the brain is able to attend to things, concentrate on things, and learn things. It also decreases impulse control, and anyone who's ever engaged with a teenager, you know, they're working on impulse control. They can be very impulsive, and nicotine decreases that even more. In terms of some other physical aspects, it increases the heart rate, it narrows the blood vessel, it is a stimulant, as we refer to nicotine, so it does increase that cardiovascular aspect. Absolutely impacts lungs, breathing ability. It can cause rapid, shallow breathing. If your teen is, you know, in band or choir or sports or anything that requires good lung capacity, using e-cigarettes is going to impact that. It impacts the mouth, whether that's cavity causing bacteria or gum disease, tooth decay, etc. And then it also decreases the effectiveness of the immune system. So we see youth and adults who are using nicotine and e-cigarettes, they are more prone to sickness and illness because their immune system is not as effective if they weren't using. So one of the other things that we see and often is an indicator that a youth might be using is when they experience withdrawal. And so, you know, we did see this last year more, I think, when teens were no longer in remote learning, though they were more at school, so they didn't necessarily have as easy of access. If they were vaping, they didn't have access to those devices when they were back at school. And so we would, you know, definitely start to see some of that nicotine withdrawal side of things. It is really hard because a lot of these symptoms on this list could also just describe a teenager. But it could also be a sign that they may be trying to quit or, haven't been able to get to their device and they're experiencing some of these things. So whether they're experiencing, depression-like symptoms, feeling down or sad, they're having trouble sleeping, they're super irritable or grouchy or super on edge, having trouble concentrating and thinking clearly if they're super restless, all of these things, being more hungry, gaining weight, those could be signs of nicotine withdrawal and a sign that they could have been using. So any questions before I jump into, I will check chat. Any questions before I jump over to cannabis? Doesn't look like it. All right, so we are going to jump into talking about cannabis because you absolutely can vape cannabis. So when we're talking about cannabis, we are specifically talking about the chemical THC. So when someone is vaping, they are, for the purposes of this presentation, we are talking about THC, and that is the psychotropic, mind-altering chemical that is found in the marijuana plant, the cannabis plant. One of the things with vaping is you can vape both the dry herb marijuana or the marijuana concentrates. And the really important thing to know about cannabis nowadays is the THC levels that exist. So 20, 30, 40, however many years ago, however many decades ago, THC levels on average were like 3 to 5%, super low. Now they are significantly higher. That dry herb marijuana is now between 15, 20%, and the marijuana concentrates, whether that's the oils, the extracts, they can be up to 95%, which is really, really high. And typically what we are seeing with youth, we don't so much see them vaping the dry herb marijuana, we very much see them vaping those concentrates, which is when we get to talking about the effects, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there are a number of different methods of cannabis use. I will very quickly go through some of them. There are lots of them. I have 6 up here. Smoking, which is the traditional smoking a joint. Dabbing, which is using those oils or wax concentrates of THC, putting it kind of directly on a heating source and then inhaling that way. Vaping, which is obviously the focus of today. So using one of those electronic devices that heats up the THC liquids, the oils, etc., and then inhaled that way. There are also edibles, topicals, and tinctures. So just kind of FYI that all of these things exist, but we are going to focus on those vaping products. So I think it is always important to think about the legal aspect of cannabis because it is ever changing every year. Every new election cycle, every new whatever, there are laws changing. So this is a map of the United States in 2022, demonstrating, showing which states either it's completely illegal, where it might be legal for medical purposes, and then medical and recreational purposes. So in Illinois, back in January of 2020, it became legal to use marijuana products for recreational purposes. You do have to be 21, so still not legal for our youth. But so we're, approaching almost 3 years of recreational legalization for cannabis in Illinois. But you can kind of see and get an idea of, which states are what and kind of where and how, that could potentially impact our youth. So, realistically, if you look at Illinois, Wisconsin and Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, all completely illegal. And then aside from Michigan, pretty much the Midwest is medical only. So Illinois, that's where we are. So it's always good to keep up with the legal side of things. So back to kind of the products and looking at some of the different visuals. So like I talked about, we're not really talking about that old way, what we kind of traditionally think of cannabis use, marijuana use with the joints. We're really looking at this middle box of these different vaping devices. And just like, with e-cigarettes, there are vaping devices for cannabis that are completely disposable or cartridge based where you switch out the cartridge, refillable, whatever. One of the other interesting things that has kind of happened over the last few years is, you can go on YouTube and, youth, the teens are figuring out how to take, an e-cigarette product because they're much cheaper, and how to kind of modify them to be able to use THC. And so while there are specific vaping devices for THC and cannabis, there's also lots of information out there, or accessible information that's out there, about how to take e-cigarettes and switch them over to cannabis. So I kind of mentioned this, earlier when first talking about THC, but this is a graph just to kind of show the pretty big increase of THC in marijuana, whether that's the concentrated oils, extracts of marijuana, and then kind of the traditional marijuana. So you can see, and this is an average, and so obviously things can be above and below, but that average THC concentration, 54%. Whereas back in 1995, it's about, 13%. That's a really big jump. And we can see even with the traditional kind of dry herb marijuana, how that, see what that increase has been like, whether it was, that 3%, now it's up to almost 14%. And so, as we're thinking about if a youth is engaging in vaping of THC, how much of an impact and what sort of difference that's going to make for them today than someone who might have used 30 years ago. Here's just some more pictures of some of the different products that are out there. Again, these up here, top middle, are the vaping devices. There's lots of other products out there, but I always, to get an idea of what is in the community, I always like to go online, go to the different, cannabis dispensaries in the area. Curaleaf, is one of the bigger ones, the one in Northbrook, and then there's also the one in Skokie, right by Old Orchard. They have all of their products online. So just go online, look to see what's happening at the local dispensary, what sort of products are out there. Obviously, our youth are not just walking into a dispensary and getting things, but it doesn't mean that adults in their lives aren't going into dispensaries, whether it's maybe an older sibling or an aunt or uncle or a family friend. The adults in the community might be accessing these products, which then could potentially provide easier access for our youth. So I always like to kind of keep up with which products are being sold locally to really get an idea of what could potentially be out there. So again, looking at cannabis use among youth, you can see vaping, definitely the method of use of choice. I guess among 12th graders, it's neck and neck with smoking, but vaping, that is definitely what we are seeing more and more and more. And that has increased over the years. So this particular data that we see here is from the Illinois Youth Survey, 2022 data. So this was collected just this past spring. So very current, and it is for suburban Cook County. So it is our kids, our youth, but we can see vaping is definitely the method of choice for those who are engaging in cannabis use. So when we think about how cannabis is impacting our youth and the brain, and again, the higher the levels of THC, the more impact and greater effects that we're going to see. So it affects lots of different areas of the brain. These are just, 9 of the different areas that THC does impact. So it impacts their thinking, their judgment, their reaction time. One of the big ones we see, especially with really high THC levels, is that panic, paranoia, anxiety. So if someone is using, 80, 90, 95% THC, they're at a much higher risk of experiencing some of those areas from the amygdala, that panic, that anxiety, fear, etc. It does impair memory. So that hippocampus is very much impacted. When I have been on the treatment side of things, I've worked with a number of youth who were struggling with cannabis use. And one of the things over and over and over from them that I would hear is that they would struggle with their memory. They didn't think it was associated with cannabis use. We worked on that, but it was like, oh, I can never remember where my keys are. I'm always losing my cell phone, or, this, that, and the next thing. And it's, yes, cannabis, that THC absolutely impacts memory. It impacts coordination. You know, one of the messages we always like to send to youth is just like driving while under the influence of alcohol is really dangerous, driving while high is equally as dangerous because it impacts that reaction time, it impacts that coordination, it impacts your depth perception, all really necessary for driving. So it is, you know, that driving while high, driving while under the influence is absolutely just as dangerous as driving under the influence of alcohol. And I know that is definitely something statewide, nationwide, we're working on getting that message across, but it still is something not all youth know, realize, understand. So some signs and symptoms that we see with cannabis, you know, yes, that feeling of being high, that euphoria, heightened sense, you know, their senses are heightened, increased blood pressure and heart rate. So cannabis is actually a stimulant. It doesn't seem that way because people always seem kind of relaxed and chill, but it's classified as a stimulant because it increases your blood pressure and increases your heart rate. Kind of, like we've talked about some of that decreased coordination, difficulty concentrating, remembering, increased appetite, etc. Kind of overall with a youth who might be struggling with cannabis use, we might see decline in schoolwork and grades, you know, because their learning and memory is impacted, changes in friends, different health issues, relationship issues. They might be more sneaky, less open, less honest, etc. You know, so if you're working with youth or have a youth in your home and you're seeing some of these things, that could definitely be a sign that they could be, you know, using cannabis. So one of the other things that's important to know about cannabis, and we do see this more with vaping because of the higher levels of THC, is overdose. So a lot of youth automatically, when they hear the word overdose, think, oh, overdose is death. You know, when we hear about an opioid overdose or a heroin overdose, you know, oftentimes the outcome is death. But when we're talking about a cannabis overdose, we are simply talking about that there is too much THC in the body that the body can handle. And so that is overdosing. And so what we see from that is very much mental components. So hallucinations, panic attacks, extreme paranoia, mental confusion. That's a lot of times what we do see with youth who may overdose on cannabis. Yes, they may have some of these other physical signs, you know, pale skin color, rapid heart rate, increased risk of heart attack, shaking, seizures, etc. But a lot of what we hear, you know, from like emergency departments, etc., is kind of that mental component, those panic attacks, that really, really extreme paranoia. And a lot of that is because they're vaping really high THC concentrates. Then there's also cannabis withdrawal. So if someone is stopping, it does take a while for withdrawal symptoms to set in because, you know, your body does store that THC in the fat cells. And so it does take the body a lot longer to get it out of its system, which is why withdrawal can, you know, be a little bit delayed versus like nicotine withdrawal, which can happen pretty quickly. Cannabis withdrawal takes a little bit longer. And so these are just some of the signs and symptoms that we might see when someone might be experiencing withdrawal from cannabis. So whether that's, again, nervousness, anxiety, panic, paranoia, irritability, disturbances in sleep, you know, THC does increase the appetite. And so all of a sudden now, if they're not using cannabis, then we might see a decrease in that appetite. Potential onset of depression. And there also could be a variety of physical symptoms, abdominal pain, fevers, chills, you know, all of those things on there. So one of the other trends that we've heard about lately that's getting a little more attention is what's called getting crossed. And this is when a youth is using both alcohol and cannabis at the same time. So a lot of times youth think, oh, I'm going to use THC because I'm going to get high and that, you know, feel that euphoria, but then I'm also going to use alcohol because I'm going to feel relaxed since alcohol is a depressant. However, that is not always the case, so that does not happen. So when you actually combine both substances and have both substances in your body at the same time, your body responds very, very differently. So when alcohol is present in the body, it impacts the way that the body's blood vessels absorb THC, and your body actually absorbs a lot more THC at a much faster rate when there's alcohol in your system. And so the user is absorbing much more THC at a much faster rate, which is going to impact them very significantly. And again, when we think about what types of products they're vaping and those high levels of THC, that is a lot of THC that's going into their system, and them not realizing that the alcohol is really, really intensifying what they could be experiencing. And so there's not a lot of data and information out on this. This is a relatively new thing that more and more research is happening, but there's still a lot unknowns, but definitely something to be aware of, because, you know, we are definitely hearing about it from parents, schools, et cetera, that youth are using those substances at the same time, and just how harmful and dangerous that can be. So some of the other reactions that we might see if someone is using both: nausea, vomiting, dizziness, disorientation, and again, that paranoia, those panic attacks, that anxiety related aspects. So one of the other things about cannabis, vaping cannabis, THC, et cetera, and this probably became a lot more popular, I don't know, maybe a year ago now. It really got on the radar of a lot of people, is Delta 8 and now Delta 10 THC. So a little bit of understanding in what kind of this is and this means, and kind of now how it relates to laws and all of that stuff. So when we're talking about THC, we have been talking about Delta 9 THC. That is what is classified as marijuana. That's what's sold in dispensaries. That's what's illegal in a lot of states, illegal for anyone under 21. It's still illegal federally. They follow all the state recreation or medical laws. That's Delta 9. That is not what we are going to talk about now. We are going to be talking about Delta 8 or Delta 10. And so where those types of THC are coming from is they are deriving those substances from hemp. And legally, by law, hemp is classified when there is less than 0.3% of Delta 9 THC. However, someone has figured out how to extract the Delta 8 and the Delta 10 THC from that hemp plant. And the hemp plant is regulated in kind of the agricultural world, because it's, you know, used for goods and foods and whatever. And it's regulated under the Hemp Farming Act, not under kind of the other drug laws that, you know, we're used to talking about. And so the access and legality of it is very, very different. And so we're seeing Delta 8 and Delta 10 showing up in vape shops, bakeries, which I'll get to, lots and lots of different places. I know there's a lot on this slide, so I'm just going to kind of hit some of the highlights. But what Delta 8 and Delta 10 THC are is they're kind of marketed as light weed or diet weed. They are absolutely still psychoactive, because it is still THC. It's just a different type of THC. So it's estimated to be about 50 to 75% is psychoactive is the Delta 9 THC. So you absolutely still can get high from it. It's just not quite as intense. You know, one of the other concerns that we have is that the Delta 8 and Delta 10s are kind of synthetically converted from the hemp plant. And so they need to use different solvents and acids and heats and other sorts of who knows what to make it. And so there are potential, you know, harmful byproducts when they are going through this kind of extraction process. So you don't necessarily know what it is that you're putting into your body. Like I shared, they can kind of be found anywhere that hemp or CBD products are sold, including online. I mean, there's a vape shop like a couple blocks away from my house, and yeah, they have it in big neon letters, Delta 8 sold here, but they're not a dispensary. They don't, you know, have the same laws, because that Delta 8 and Delta 10 are regulated differently. But just like, you know, we're talking about vaping that Delta 9 THC, you can absolutely still vape Delta 8 or Delta 10 THC, and you still definitely can get high from it. So it absolutely can impact our youth similarly. Some of the other things that we see from intoxication, decreased movements, decreased psychomotor activity, still that increased heart rate, low blood pressure, can impact their breathing, some slurred speech, some different ones that we haven't always seen. These are ways that someone who's using Delta 8 THC or Delta 10 THC might experience or exhibit. I know this is not specifically vaping, but whenever I'm talking about Delta 8, I always like to talk about it. So this is from the Northbrook Bakery, Wake and Bakery, that sells the Delta 8 infused bakery products. So as an FYI, it's over there on Dundee Road. So, it is interesting just as we're thinking about our youth and how they are exposed to different ways of, cannabis products. This is one that's out there. You are technically supposed to be 21 to buy it. And I'm not trying to throw any business under the bus or anything like that. But it is a little concerning for our youth that there's all of these yummy, fun, delicious looking things, but it is something that people can get high from, but it is legal. Any questions specifically on that before I jump into some data and wrap things up for today? Doesn't look like it. All right, so just to kind of get an idea of the data portion of things, what we are seeing, how many students are using. Luckily, most students are not using. Yes, it often seems like most students are using because that's what we're hearing about, but most are not. We do know, and this is something absolutely in the past 2 years, 2+ years, we have seen students who are having mental health issues, whether it's depression, anxiety, etc., they are much more likely to engage in vaping, either nicotine or cannabis. Our local data also shares that student athletes are also more likely to use, which is interesting. Just a fun little nugget there. And it's interesting because vaping, either substance, can absolutely impact their overall health, their lung health, etc., which I would think would be really important to them. So just, yeah, interesting piece there. So looking at some current data, so we have the 2021 National Monitoring the Future data. So that's a nationwide, the orange is some nationwide data. And then again, we have our 2022 Suburban Cook County, Illinois Youth Survey data. So luckily, at least on here, our Suburban Cook County numbers are lower for e-cigarette use than the national averages, which is really great. So about 3% of 8th graders in Suburban Cook County have used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days, 8% of 10th graders, and 14% of 12th graders. We have seen a significant decrease in e-cigarette use over the years. And I very much attribute that to kind of the really quick and urgent response of those of us who are in the field, teachers, educators, parents, etc., getting to kids at those younger ages when we did first learn about all of the harms of, e-cigarettes. If I think about, like 7 years ago when they first were coming out and we were really pushing information out there about just the risks and harms of it, those kids were like, potentially 5th grade, and now those kids are in high school. And so we have seen a big decrease in use, and I do attribute a lot of that kind of to education and understanding of all of those risks. Obviously, still work to be done. It definitely always seems like more kids are using than that, but according to our data, this is what it is. So obviously still work to do, but definitely moving in a positive direction. And then when we look at cannabis use, similarly, Suburban Cook County is lower than national averages. So 2% of 8th graders have used cannabis in the past 30 days, 8% of 10th graders, and 16% of 12th graders. So just to really kind of get an idea of how many students are using. And so, when talking with youth, being able to share with them some data and talking about how most aren't using and the norm is not to use can really help support their decision not to use. Because we all know that our youth want to fit in and want to feel normal and all of that stuff. And so the normal thing, the majority of students are not using, which is really great. So one of the other things when we're thinking about substance use and thinking about why students might be vaping, why they might be engaging in use, we hear a variety of things from youth. These are a lot of the common ones. And like, I just shared earlier, a lot of it is right now dealing with stress, anxiety, mental health. That is far and wide what we are hearing now, that they're really using it to cope just with all the stress that, they've had going on. And I think, to some extent over the last couple of years, if some of them started using, when we were home more because they didn't know what to do or they were bored, and then they become addicted and are still struggling with use. But, kind of that mental health component really is what we're seeing. So just real quick, as we think about how do we, we have all this information, we understand the risks, we understand the consequences, how do we talk to the teens, whether it's our own child, our own teen, or we work with teens, or it's, a family friend or, grandchild, whoever it is, how do we talk to them about this? Because all this information is super important for them to know as well. So really when we're thinking about talking with our teens, our goal is to have a conversation about how vaping can really impact their health, their goals, their future. Want to be really clear with, what we're saying about them, being really clear and direct, clear consequences, explaining why, utilizing facts and consequences that will resonate with them. The way we talk about it in the prevention world, it's not one 60-minute conversation, it's 61-minute conversation. So these are just kind of small ongoing conversations to have with whatever teen is in your life. And one of the other things that I always like to make sure that I cover is why teens choose not to use. Whether they've never used before and they don't want to ever use, or maybe they have experimented, they have tried, or they are using, there are still times they're choosing not to use. And I think having a conversation, understanding why they choose not to use is super important in helping support and understand their motivations to not use. By and far, whenever we're talking to students, number one reason why they choose not to use is to be in control of their body and actions. And hopefully, as we've seen, how it in both nicotine and cannabis at THC impact the brain and the body, it absolutely impacts and impairs their ability to totally be in control of the body and actions. One of the other top ones is parent expectations, or potentially getting in trouble with their parents or disappointing their parents. So parents do matter. I always like to make sure parents know that. They are listening. It is important. And that is often one of the top reasons why teens choose not to use. So, some open-ended questions. If it's hard to start a conversation on these topics, here are just some examples of how to go about doing that. What are you learning? What are your thoughts? How can I support you? How do you feel about a friend is using? Just really leave it open for them, provide that space for them to talk and you listen. It's not always us talking. It's definitely that balance of talking and listening. And then some other helpful messages, kind of really specific to vaping, and whether it's e-cigarettes or that THC, talking about how big tobacco, now big marijuana is what they're calling it, how those kind of businesses are taking advantage of youth. They are trying to find their new customers. Their customers, especially with big tobacco, are dying. And so they need new ones. Trying not to be fooled by celebrities and social media promotions and what they're seeing out there, and having some of that, media literacy and all of the messages that are coming at them. Contributing to environmental damage. All of these disposable e-cigarettes, where are those going? They're definitely messing with the environment. So if you have an environmentally conscious kid, that could definitely be a good talking point. And just really getting down to making smart and healthy choices, helping them really understand what it could do to them and how it can impact them. And so why would they want to, potentially jeopardize what they got going on, their brain, their body, etc. So really using that as kind of the message and talking with them. It's not an easy conversation, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. All right. So 2 minutes for questions. If there are any questions, feel free to chat, raise your hand. I am going to stop sharing. And that is it for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin.
Of course.
Any questions? Well, I really thank you for the talk today. And if there are any questions, feel free to email us here and I can connect you to Erin and she will be able to help you. So feel free to email us here. All right. Well, thank you again, Erin, and to the Glenview Northbrook Coalition for Youth. We thank you for speaking to us today. This concludes our YMCA Education Series presentation on behalf of the North Suburban YMCA and our YES series. We thank you for your support today and for organizations like this. A special thank you again to GNCY and Erin. And any other questions? Yeah, I saw a question.
I have to leave for a 2 o'clock meeting. I was just saying goodbye.
Oh, bye.
And thank you.
Thanks for being on the call.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye. All right, our next talk is
Okay.
next week. But have a great time, everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.